Welcome to Philly Coco Presents Side Project Spotlight, episode 22. This is the developer's journey to making cool stuff. We are the cranky uncles, giving you bad financial advice at your developer's family reunion. I'm Kotaro.
I'm Steve.
And I'm Aaron.
And we are Philly Coco, a Philadelphia-based Cocoa Heads community focused on Apple development. That primarily, but not exclusively, means iOS, Mac, tvOS, and watchOS development. Philly Coco's true desire is to take you higher on your own developer journey.
Very nice.
All right.
Nailed it.
All right. Bad financial. I was trying to figure out if I should sneak in some crypto references, but I was like, we don't really promote crypto here, so it would be pretty. I don't want people to take the wrong type of implication here.
It might also feel like you're putting salt in the wound right now for some people.
That's true. That's very true. So we try not to do that here. We're trying to keep it positive.
Trying to be neutral here.
Light. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
We're all about tech, man.
That's right. We're all about making stuff. And speaking of making stuff, we are making some progress on the PickleJar app. Our sort of, I guess instead of calling it like a to-do list app is what we sort of originally called it, I think we've kind of leaned closer to like a habit-forming app, like a way to sort of build better habits. Is that a fair assessment, Aaron and Steve?
Definitely not like a straight-up to-do app.
Yeah.
It's more of a long-term goal, app. So I guess habit.
We'll find out when we figure out the UI. We'll find out what it is.
I mean,
that's been the constant for the past 2 podcasts so far. Is the pain point, really? I
mean, we had an in-person session for the first time in forever.
That's right. Side Project Saturday is back in real life.
At least it was. We're taking this month to month, so I don't know what it's going to be like next month. But we were in the Human Robot. I think we talked about it briefly last time. We were at Human Robot Jenkintown. Good turnout for Side Project Saturday. Usual people came, plus surprise. And it was a good time.
Yeah, I think
we made some progress too.
It's much, it's kind of hard to remember how easy it is to sort of have the better back and forth about figuring out the ideas or understanding the problems that we're trying to solve. Going with you, Aaron, and sort of walking through and trying to figure out that sort of iPhone problem we were having. With the navigation split view, which is kind of cool, and it's being that it is a new addition to iOS 16, but it is still beta, so it does feel a little weird, and there's not many very good examples of how to use it in a 3-column kind of configuration, which is what I was testing for this sort of app, but that's kind of getting too deep in the woods, so apologies for that.
Yeah.
I think where we're at the moment is, I think we've sort of talked about this, is just trying to get the root functionality of all the features into the app from a functional point of view. So adding a goal, adding a sprint for these goals, and adding the features for so that we can kind of define sort of the timeline for these goals. I
mean, we have basic CRUD features in there. Been there for a while.
Yeah,
you've been just iterating on the UI stuff, and Aaron and I have been messing around with refactoring the architecture a bunch because we're trying to learn how the heck you're supposed to do SwiftUI and CoreData syncing and stuff in a reasonable way. Even though we're basically over engineering it, but that's because we're part of the whole point of the app was to learn how to do things a more proper way. So, quote unquote, you can't see me doing this listening, but I'm doing air quotes. Proper.
Yeah. I was looking at the CoreData MVVM thing again, and just looking at just having a completely separate model thing of not treating CoreData like the model at all, and making new structs for everything, and keeping CoreData isolated to its own thing.
I mean, we were discussing yesterday that the way I was looking at it was maybe we treat it more like if you were building an HTTP API, and you're passing in your defined structures and getting out defined structures, and you don't really care how it works in the back end. So from the perspective of the view, what Aaron and I we want is when you're working on the views, Kotaro, like, the SwiftUI stuff, that you don't have to worry about anything related to core data or thinking about how it's stored or anything like that. You just have like a view model or whatever you want to call it that's there. It's available. It has like structs that you can easily grab onto. It has like maybe some methods that you can pass the structs back into that then in the background takes care of syncing it up with the core data. Because right now we have the actual core data models exposed in places, and it's fine. I mean, it's not like it's bad, broken or anything. I mean, it works. It's just that we'd rather not do that, and it does mean you have to do a lot of optionals.
Yeah, I mean, for people who don't know in that regard, like core data is much more of an object mapping to most cases a local database, right? A SQLite database where you can store. So you can store a how would we almost like a relational database if you're familiar.
I mean,
with, like,
core data is so
SQL Server.
confusing. It's an object model, right? It's not a straight up that it uses a SQL database, but that's more of
yeah.
It's more like an implementation detail almost than it is.
Yeah. Like you can save it to a JSON, an XML, whatever data, or a custom data storage if you want.
Because it's older technology. It's based around classes and lots of optional properties, and it comes from the long ago Objective C days. So,
object-oriented programming.
I remember when that was the cool new thing. Sort of. So
don't date us, man.
it exists. I mean, it's there's mechanisms to use it in SwiftUI. The Apple provides are very convenient, but as we talked about before, not necessarily the way you want to do it if you're building like an app that has maybe long life ahead of it.
So
it just rubs me the wrong way coming from more enterprise stuff where I don't like mixing in things with views.
I'm thinking about like making it I started work on like basically kind of a global app object of like the model that exists in the app, and that's going to be separate from core data. So
yeah, we were talking about a little bit about that yesterday. That's how a lot of that's similar to some ways that we've done enterprise stuff where if you have this complicated model, sometimes you just need like one entry point into it. And I think that would simplify things. That's how if you remember way back the beginning, I started building the model the view model with one class because that was my thinking.
Well, then the view models can like each of the views can have their own view model that just knows about their own section of the model. So it's like it seems way complicated, but I think it'll make everything easier once it's set up.
I was looking at the food truck app from Apple, and it's not bad at all for an example app. They put some stuff in a framework, what do they call that thing?
Package.
The package. They package it up.
I really like that.
Yeah, we should do that. We can do that with this model stuff once it's working. We can package it.
But it wasn't organized the way I would normally organize it. More like architecture-wise, it was kind of. I think they were organizing by screen or something. It's a little unclear exactly what their pattern is for organizing all the files.
Yeah, I think that kind of makes sense, but just because it's a lot of you almost like structuring based on feature view. Although there's also components in that example, so like some places are reused in other spots, so that's where it gets confusing because sometimes it's like a grid view, but that grid view is shared in other views, which makes sense. It's actually quite nice in that sense.
I don't know. Do they name things by what type of object or whatever they are? Because do they have things like named something view model or something model or something like that's so common in other languages?
So I don't know if it's kind of funny that you mentioned it. I don't know if Apple does label things with a suffix of view model a lot, if at all, in any of their examples. I know, like if you look at Ray Winderlich, they do. If something's a view, they usually are pretty explicit that that's a view usually. But if it's a component, then it's a little more Wild West. Like it doesn't say like suffix component, like truck component or grid like they don't do that, but they so it's like a little loosey goosey in that regard. Like, so I prefer to be like if I'm saying something's a view model or if something's a view, I kind of really like to be explicit about it and just say it's a view, even if it's a little verbose.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. In like C# land or Java land or something like that, you're usually kind of naming things very explicitly.
Yeah,
it has its pros and cons. I mean, ultimately, I think it's probably long-term better to be more explicit because your future self will thank you when you're looking for something.
I mean, it's kind of interesting because a lot of colleagues that come into SwiftUI from like a React Native or React style or JavaScript framework of some kind will like pretty much when they create a variable, they're usually using like very short like letter, JC or X or or I as a stand-in for index or something like that. And in Swift, they usually just try to spell that out, just to be. Or sometimes they do stuff that's all caps, and like a snake. I think that's the term, like all caps with underscores, and sometimes just to like be explicit that this is a constant or something. And I don't know if that's something borrowed from like the JavaScript world, but it does look familiar from other languages. But yeah, so like people will bring their style into Swift, like in a development environment in Swift because it's so familiar. But it's also not the Swift way of doing things. It's almost like the reason why Swift lint exists at all is like, hey, don't do that.
We were trying to do an update on the app status, right? So we got into we're getting into a whole discussion of architecture, which is great. But so we were, so Aaron and I are still, as I say, working on that architecture changes, which is more of a thing you don't have to worry about too much because we're just going to refactor code as we go. And we said that before, and we've been just churning on that because it's, as I said, it's not as straightforward. Maybe some people listening are like, I know exactly how to do this, but we looked around and there's conflicting ideas, and we come at it from different experiences. So we're playing around with that to find something that works for us that's not too complicated.
Yeah, I just figured like I would just start building some options and try them out because our thing is not so complicated. We can't just like build a thing and try it out. And
while we're doing that, you have definitely been working on the UI. Like there's been progress made.
It's progress, but it's almost like this is admittedly a frustrating flaw in the way I design UI. To be fair, is that I'm kind of sketching, and I'm almost sketching. And SwiftUI almost makes it somewhat a little too easy to like sketch out ideas. It's great for that, in a sense, right? Because like you go, oh well, maybe I can try this. You just change a few things around, and the code is very lightweight for the most part. Like usually a Swift file is, if it's above 300 lines of code, you're probably doing something too complex and you should break it out. It's fantastic for that like refactoring kind of way of like, and you can kind of see where the repetitions are happening, so which you can like shrink something down and tighten it up. But at the same time, the challenge of that is like there's a lack of commitment that I'm sort of isolating out. And maybe the model will help, like solidifying the model and maybe even solidifying the backend in that sense will help inform that decision. But so right now, what I'm trying to do is there's when we had that little whiteboarding-ish or sketch session that we were doing.
Yeah, we were using my iPad mini yesterday to sketch some stuff, which I think was actually very helpful. Yep. Because I was trying to, I've had this vision about how I think some of the stuff should look, and it was helpful just to sketch it out. We were actually sketching UI ideas because you had built on top of Apple's
very basic.
What was the framework you were using? You were trying out the new stuff.
Oh,
right?
Swift, the navigation split view, which allows you to create a 2-column or 3-column view, kind of like a sidebar, and then the detail view, and then it can switch between it can easily switch between that, or like if you're on an iPhone, it'll just switch to go to like the main list view, and then the details
to a hamburger menu.
After
years of Apple telling us, don't design your apps with a hamburger menu. There was like an entire talk, wasn't there, at WWDC about this? Mm-hmm. And now they built a framework to use, which just automatically makes a hamburger menu. And I looked at this and I said, "What the? They changed their mind? I don't know. They just they just gave up."
I would say that they tried to do it their way. Like Apple has a tendency to say this is the wrong way until they come up with their way, and their way is still not particularly great on the iPhone.
I guess it's about having like a functional thing on the iPhone, but when designing for the like iPad first.
I thought it was going to render as like a tab view, or there's going to be an easier way of doing that, because it feels like to me, if you I guess it makes sense because you could have too many items for that to happen. But on an iPhone, it feels like most of the time, if you're doing a split view or even if a 3-column one, that first column should be a tab view under most circumstances.
I thought, that's what I thought. Like that's what I had hoped.
I guess you need to implement that yourself. Just if you don't get that for free.
Yeah. So you can say, I mean, it's not tremendously hard to just have a conditional, either whether through a macro or the view that fits, maybe.
Yeah, we were talking about that. So yeah, there's already so many like conditionals. I don't know. That's like an area where it's still a little rough to have multi-platform, even though they added all these frameworks now. You still end up with like conditionals places and like.
This is the challenge. This is the challenge when we talk about cross-platform, in the sense of like when we originally were going out to build this app, our original intention was to build a Mac app. But because none of us, and with good reason too, is willing to install on our main machine, or like Ventura.
We don't have an extra computer to run beta software.
Also, we'd have no idea when Mac OS update's going to come out, but it's usually the case that iOS and iPad OS come out first if there's going to be any kind of delay or different timing. So it makes sense to focus on the thing that's going to come out first.
All right. So just for context, you can't build a Ventura app on a Mac app, Ventura Mac app on, what are we on, Monterey? So, which I guess, as painful as that sounds, I guess sort of makes sense in its own way.
I mean, yeah, because they tied stuff, as they often do. It's like some of the frameworks are probably tied to the OS updates.
So we've sort of decided not to focus on the Mac first and then kind of work kind of slightly backwards, like the iPad first, then the iPhone.
Pure Mac people hate that, but we're kind of thinking of the iPad as working mostly in both, at least the main screen, not like all the little details you need for a Mac app, but right, like the main window for the stuff. So we have this working with these with the 2-column, or we had 3 columns, and it was a little buggy on the iPhone side, and Aaron found a fix yesterday for that. Yeah, I don't know if you want. So there's like do you think this was like a common problem people are going to run into? You want to explain what you did? If people are using the split view, and you're trying to make it work on because it worked fine on iPad, right? But then when it got to the iPhone,
basically the original implementation was, and I think it still is that it's when you select something on the main sidebar, you're really just saying, okay, based on what you've selected, select a category. So let's say goal, sprint, and reports.
The first level in the hierarchy.
We save that as an enum. We're selecting an enum, and then we're just going through that. Like you pick, the goal enum, the sprint enum.
You pick whatever. Goals, and it would push the goals list on, and that'd be fine. Then you hit back, and then you try to hit goals again or anything else at the top level, it just wouldn't work anymore. But it was only happening on iOS, not on iPad OS.
But I think the reason why, and Aaron, the way you fixed it was basically just nilling that out, right?
Yeah. I don't know if that's really the best. I don't know if it's like a bug or something. When you go back, it doesn't like unselect.
It makes sense because basically that's a state.
Yeah.
And so we didn't change the state. I actually did nil out some of the lower ones, but I totally forgot about the select category but that was more like a premature, like, oh, I'm concerned, like it's going to still think it's on this row in the lower level, the second row or the second column or the third column. I just wanted to make sure like it was cleared up, but I totally forgot about the select category. So being like the top level selection item. But it's a weird like scenario that only shows up in an iPhone.
I don't know. I need to look into what is it called? Navigation path the new navigation path thing. I think you can use that in the split view. It's part of the whole new navigation SwiftUI stuff they have in iOS 16.
Yeah.
So,
and that's another thing too, because they've changed about a lot in the navigation, the way you do navigation. Well, now they call them navigation stacks instead of navigation view. Your mental model has to change in terms of how you create the routes, basically. They call them paths, but and how you change it based on what you selected. It's all based, it's like almost like they have a navigation data model of sorts, right? Like that's kind of how that drives it.
So, Aaron, your fix for this, just to make it clear if anyone's listening, they want to know. It looks like in the code you use this dot on change of is presented, and then if there was no value for that, you set the select category to nil, and the select category is like I think a binding.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's a binding. Select category is a binding that's being used for the navigation push. But this is presented thing is new, right? Relative, is that this year or last year?
I think it's new.
It's replacing something else, though, right?
Yeah, it's
replacing the presentation mode.
Yeah, so it's an
environment.
It's an environment variable. Yeah, so you had to grab from the environment the dot is presented, and then when that changes, that means that this particular view is presented. Is that what that means?
Yeah, well, it gets set to false when you hit the back button.
Oh, it gets set to false. Okay,
yeah.
So you just set it to nil.
Yeah,
and so then everything works again. So that's one fix. Then apparently, looking into is presented.
Yeah,
that is pretty funny.
But why did it only work? It's only an iOS thing.
Well, because it's not. It's everything is fully expanded, right? There is no like back, right? It's like it just expands into the different side, the detail section of the side, the split view. So it's not on iPhone. There's only one view, and it's like pushing it onto the stack.
Right.
This is interesting to keep in mind, even when you're using these frameworks. Like the differences between an iPhone, especially, and everything else, can throw you for a loop, even on something as basic as a push navigation stack.
Right.
So I thought that was kind of interesting. This bug even existed.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a bug with iOS 16 or something because it should.
It could be.
Yeah,
I mean,
we could file a what do they call it? It's not a radar anymore.
Oh, I think they still call it a file radar or something.
Well, we could file a radar if we think it's a bug, but
or it could be a problem with our implementation of the original navigation split view.
Oh, so I was saying we were sketching stuff literally sketching stuff yesterday. For you that you're going to try to implement this week, right, Kotaro? Like some of these ideas and some of the ideas. Did you want to try to explain any of the ideas, or?
I think some of the ideas were either we were going to mark out in a row what are the days of the sprint that you've completed and what are they not. So it's kind of like a row of check marks or some kind of UI, some kind of indication of that you've completed this out of all the days in the sprint. So I'll probably explore that opportunity for each goal that you've entered, and then that'll be the first iteration of this idea. And then I still have to fill out the sprint UI just to enter all the metadata, like the configuration of start date, end date, that kind of stuff. So that'll be in my next PR, and get those in so that we can actually test it in a realistic manner.
Yeah. So how are you going to go about implementing some of this? You're going to grab things from, going to grab the cards. I think one of the ideas was a card view for some of this stuff. So
yeah,
you're going to grab that card stuff from Kanji Love.
Yeah, one thing we might do is use the Twinder.
Twinder. That could be an app. That'd be a weird app.
Yeah, the Tinder UI interface of where you swipe right if you did it, swipe left if you didn't, or maybe swipe up if you want to skip it for now.
Yeah. So that only kind of we're talking about this only kind of works on iOS though.
Yeah.
But the reason we were talking about this is the idea of this is you're not going to have a gazillion to-do items. It's more like you have these higher level goals, like like the exercise one's a common one where you want to do. We talked about the push-ups one is your big example. You want to do 25 push-ups maybe 3 times a week on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and so a view on the iPhone makes sense that maybe a primary view is to say, what do I have to do today?
Yeah,
and then you could have cards because you should only really have a handful of goals in the day to look at. So you could present them in some way, and then you could do them one at a time. That may work, may not work. But then swipe gesture is great for that kind of thing. So I did that, and then you can log your progress. Or no, I didn't do that. Right. That makes sense. But we had a little bit of an issue trying to figure out how is it going to work on an iPad.
One of the ideas might just be take advantage of each platform, right? That's sort of that's been my having done cross-platform development in a variety of different ways. And I mean, when I mean cross-platform, I mean cross-platform, like iOS, Android, web for one platform kind of development. You find yourself trying to build your brand on these platforms and sort of dictate what the UI looks like and kind of try to make it uniform, right? But what you end up doing a lot of times is just making it worse for all the brands involved, right?
Yeah, we were talking about having like the Mac app, the iPad app, maybe have different focus on on the view that you're looking at and what you're trying to accomplish, because you have the bigger screen, you have different gestures available.
Like the Mac app could have maybe the text field exposed of like the notes for the notes. Or
well, I mean, let's stick to like what we're actually building right now, which is the iPad and iOS version. So like the iPad version, similarly, the idea is more of the stuff will be exposed, but maybe the view you go to is a more expansive version of what's going on in your life.
Like maybe the whole Tinder interface wouldn't be ideal for the iPad, but maybe so then maybe a grid mode would make more sense of maybe like a combination of like, did you do any of these?
So that means you need different like view hierarchies, at least to some degree, right? Yeah. So how do you branch off like that in SwiftUI, where so you can go into one hierarchy versus another one?
There's actually ways to do it. I was about to say like you can easily do a macro, but actually there is a device like UI device API you can use to identify if it's an iPad or an iPhone pretty quickly. So you can say like if it's an iPhone, just do this. If it's everything else, do that. Meaning like so have the Tinder interface versus like the grid view.
So maybe wrap it all up in a view, and then so you're not making it messy in your switch. So you have your SwiftUI view. You might have a
I'll call it like Tinder view versus
like Tinder view or something, and then you just
grid view.
You say if it's iOS, you do this one, the other one. Yeah, I mean, I noticed when you're messing around with switching between the different platforms. It can get a little messy in the SwiftUI view with too many macros kind of spread in there. And it's confusing to follow.
Originally, there was a macro, but then you can convert it to something that's a little cleaner. In the case of the macro, the reason why it's a macro is because you're adding and removing or hiding modifiers.
Yeah, and some modifiers only exist on some platforms. Right. But in this case, I'm saying like if you just need to select between two different view hierarchies, I guess. I mean, that could include some stuff that requires macros to switch. In
that case, that's not so bad. Or what you can do is you create the all-encompassing detail view, right, for, let's say, goals, right? And then you can say in that view, you can do the switch statement there. Or even,
I think you really have to compose the views is what I'm trying to get at. In my mind, you really have to compose it. So if you have like a detail view, everything inside that, like, or at the point where you have to diverge the hierarchies, there should be one view file that you import versus the other one, and then everything in that is for the one for iOS and the other one's for iPadOS. Because otherwise, you get into the one problem I see, and I know you're just churning stuff, but when you're switching like around inside a SwiftUI file, it can get really confusing as to like which. What's actually active at any given time. Mm-hmm. When you're trying to follow the code, because like, well, this is for iOS, this is iPadOS, but then they're the way they're laid out, laid out in the view, it can be hard to follow because you have these macros in the way, and you have like the problem with views to me in SwiftUI, they work best when you really don't have any logic in them or the very bare minimum, because you don't want them. I don't know. The way they're structured, it just gets, I think, really confusing to follow.
Sure.
Pretty easily, and so composing them, I think, is a really big deal. Which I know I'm just I know this is obvious, but
I guess it's a question of like whether or not you can keep it isolated, even if you have to use macros. If you just keep it isolated in a spot that makes sense, right? Versus like
that's what I'm saying. So it's a challenge with any kind of development, but especially I feel like especially with the SwiftUI stuff, it shouldn't be. It is and it isn't. You know what I mean?
It's a different challenge, right?
It's just different challenge.
Like I it's been so long since I've been doing UI kit. I'm like trying to remember like the pain points in UI kit these days. Great example, I guess, is like people who whine and moan about storyboards and say, oh, I don't like storyboards and it's auto layout and blah blah blah.
The auto layout does hurt sometimes.
It does hurt, yes. But writing it all in code is, to me, the most.
It was awful. I remember doing that. I remember lining up table cells in like not auto layout code, which I've done, but I mean like frame code. Like you're literally positioning them. That was really painful, and like figuring out the size for things. I was like, oh my god.
Like I think that's the part that I always struggle. Like I'm a very for me, I'm a very visual person. So in the sense of like I need to see the layout. As I construct
you need to see it in real life, not in your mind.
Not in the code. I'm not like Neo. I can't see it like the code bleeding down the screen and like, oh yeah, I get that's the UI, that's the city right there. So and I guess so like I remember those pain points of like, the issues related to like auto layout, particularly. Like trying to get or like even like you would look at some of the horrible console logs of like you doing something funky in the UI in the storyboard UI, and you're just like, oh, I need to like, and they tell you what to look for, and I've gotten better about it, but geez, like it's like figuring that out was like a fine-tuned comb.
Look, man, sometimes stuff would work, and then there'd be an update, like an iOS update, and then it would start spewing errors out, and like because they'll deprecate something or whatever. I mean, that's the way Apple platforms move fast. And but they usually keep deprecated stuff around for a long time, though. They just warn you about it, just clutter your console.
I mean, I guess like getting back to the point of like conditionally like changing the UI in the sense of like I kind of prefer to like, and I know up front it's a lot more pain to change your UI or configure your UI to best fit the platform. But I've always been a proponent of saying respect the platform, damn it. Just let the platform sing in the ways that it's comfortable with. And then it even goes to the differentiates between an iPhone versus an iPad versus a Mac, right? What are the strengths of those platforms, and what are we doing to like to take our content and let the platform elevate the content, right?
Yeah, and that kind of I want to segue to this. It kind of you talk about respecting the platform. There's been a little bit of a kerfuffle lately in the Apple developer community about
you
Notion.
Don't say. Let me guess. It was on Twitter.
Yes, it was on Twitter. I mean, I saw it as a Paul Hudson a quote tweet, but other people talked about it where the Notion app, Notion that
yes.
I don't even know how you describe that, like web database app. It's like it's weird. You can build all kinds of data structures and stuff in there, but they have notes and stuff in there. They have an iOS app, and they tweeted that the mobile app got an upgrade. It's now twice as fast on iOS, and they did it by redesigning using native components. Okay. So Paul Hudson had a little bit of a snarky tweet, and he's like, to quote, he says, "But how? What kind of impressive code could deliver a 2 to 3x speed boost? Quote, redesigned using native components." End quote. I've been building native apps for about 12 years now, all the time having folks try to tell me web-based technologies will beat native. They continue to be wrong. And tweet quote. So that was like a common like argument. Yeah, I think all the React Native people got mad, and
I'm surprised the Flutter people didn't like join in on the mad like controversy, the brouhaha in my mind. But
because it's coming from Paul Hudson, who's well respected in the community, kind of he I don't know how he writes as much freaking example code as he does all the time for his books and stuff.
Great control. But shout out to you, Paul.
Yeah,
we always point to you as our inspiration.
We do, and because of that, I think it got a lot of attention. But I don't think he's wrong most of the time. And most of the time, using web components in your app will end up being slower, but that doesn't always mean it's the wrong move.
I feel like I'm jumping in a landmine right here.
Yeah,
it's and not in the sense like I care about other people's opinion, but just from a personal point of view, a personal experience point of view, trying to build web views that were because I think that was in the early days, WebView, before React Native, before Flutter, like the idea to do cross-platform development, it was like this, like, okay, we'll just put a WebView and we'll build the app.
Wait, wasn't it the
app.
sweet solution for year one of the iPhone? Wasn't it called didn't Jobs call it the sweet solution? Just web apps?
yeah. Even Jobs was like, this sucks. We're going native eventually. So even Jobs started out that way as your SDK option. I'm going to try to I'm going to try to do this as eloquent as I can, only because my experience kind of spans fairly far into trying to build cross-platform apps, and this even predates. Like as a consumer, I remember when Macs were like, Apple was always prefixed with what was it? Beleagued. Like beleagued Apple. Apple's going bankruptcy. Apple is going to be bought out by big company X or Y because they're doomed, and they're you could buy Apple stocks for like $8 a share. Could you imagine that? There was a time, it was right before Steve Jobs, but I just remember there was a time when Microsoft was like, yeah, we'll give you Word on the Mac. And the Word they gave us was the most infamously word ever imagined. It was basically like they took the Windows version and then they slapped version on the Mac and they called it Windows 5, Word 5 or something. It was just Word. It wasn't even Office. No Excel, no nothing. But they tried to make it look like Windows, right? And I remember this like constant thing of like, oh my God, like there's no... it was almost like some of it, and even Adobe and Photoshop were all just like, yeah, we're just going to make it look like the crappiest version of the software. We don't care about. So
they weren't respecting like the platform as an identity.
No. And why? And to be fair, why would they? Right? They weren't going to make any money. It wasn't going to get them anything. And so
it was a business decision, you think?
Right. So
or is it? Well, I mean, the question is, was it a business decision or was it a lack of knowledge decision, or kind of? I think it was a combination.
It was a combination. I feel like it was practical. I honestly don't argue with that decision that they made, because Apple didn't have their bleep together at that time. Going forward, when Apple came out with iLife and was it iOffice? It was basically like
iWork.
iWork. Thank you. Yeah. So which is Page's Keynote. It was a prerequisite to Page's Keynotes and Numbers and the other one. I forget the other one. I think it was Keynote. Anyway, the whole point was like they had said, you know what, we are the only ones that's going to respect our platform, so we have to build the crucial apps that will make our platform attractive. And in many ways, Mac developers had the same type of sort of attitude. It's like, nobody's going to make apps for this platform. That's kind of where the whole shareware ecosystem of the Mac came from, was this attitude of like, nobody's going to do it for us. We can do it ourselves and make decent money doing it. And they made really good apps, like really well-crafted apps, because at that time, they thought of themselves as more of craftsmen, more of artistes, more as people that were building something, a software of quality, and they cared about it. They cared about, how it interacted and took advantage of whatever that platform, the Mac platform's, sort of frameworks, and whether it be services, Apple script, integrations, whatever Apple had offered at the time as a framework, CoreData, whatever. And then when the iPhone became the dominant, type of kind of app, app platform, and everybody was like bragging about it, and then they would always, we moved into sort of like iPhone first, Android second. I kind of had the sort of inverse kind of feeling about that, where when you develop for Android, you were like, okay, let's just slap the iPhone interface on top. Who cares that there's already a tab bar by default on Android? We're going to put another tab bar on top of that, right? And I was like, oh man, that's like old school Amazon, but crappy. But it was just like, and I felt bad. I was like, man, I can't believe we are building, and we built it in a web view on top of that.
We did that too at my day job. The very first version was a web view, looked basically the same across the platforms and performed crappily on all of them too.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing, like, Android has a tremendous wealth of value in the sense that it is the dominant market share, but it also has its own unique personality, and you can't just slap a tab bar on the bottom and call it a day and say, okay, well, or you can't just do, let me just do Flutter and not make Flutter or React Native and not expect like it to be crappy on both platforms or feel weird. I should say that. And I get that point about like you have a limited set of resources. Maybe your team is more web dominant, right? Like your team has their skill sets are in web and they don't want to learn native because native is different. Like to develop for native, there's a different mindset. There's a different like you hate this idea like, geez, I have to like recompile constantly or the live preview isn't going fast because I don't have an M1, right? Like, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why as a web developer working in Xcode is a frustrating experience. I mean, it's a frustrating experience as a native developer. And I think you just sort of learn to sort of roll with those punches. But as a web developer, you're coming from a lightweight text editor with tons of sweet plugins.
I remember when we built the first web app version of the app at my day job, we tried to make it look like it was native.
Yeah.
Like with tables and stuff.
We actually had to like, when we did it, when we were trying to do the push navigation, we had to do that manually. And I know like React Native and Flutter does that for you, and they've tweaked the timing and they've adjusted it so it feels close. But I always feel like as a user, you don't necessarily know something's different, but you feel it. Like you can kind of look at an app and go, is that React or is that Flutter? And I think people forget. And so like a lot of times, there's that old quote, the man who chases two rabbits catches neither. And so you're always chasing this idea of like a unicorn, right? Of like, you're going to be able to be on multiple platforms at once. And if you're a startup, that makes some sense, right? That makes a fair amount of sense.
I think some people pointed that out on Twitter. It might make complete sense to just be like, we're going to do it with web technologies, have it work all across all these platforms. And that does make sense to me. Like, the important thing is to have the functionality available to the users. They're still getting value, even if it's not the best experience. But if long term, I think for your brand, and for your long term customers, you probably want to try to get your apps to feel like they belong on the platforms that people are using. Because when you're a user, at least for me, when I'm using apps and one of them just feels incongruent to how the rest work or how I expect the platform to work, like I don't really want to use that app. And if I don't want to use that app, then you're not going to get advertising dollars from me if you're using that as a model. I might be looking for an alternative just because I don't like using it.
And the funny thing, like I always go back to like, regardless if it's web, React or whatever, or even native, like speed is a feature, whatever your platform of choice is. Like if it takes more than 3 seconds for things to load in, like you got to fix that somehow. It can't feel janky. If the word of your users it says it's janky, that needs to be fixed, regardless of platform.
Yeah, I mean, in this particular case, I haven't used Notion much. I think this issue is really about speed
Mm-hmm. Well, my understanding was like part of the reason why it sped up was I think people pre-assumed it was like native, but I think it was actually web views that drove a lot of it.
The whole app is a web app to begin with.
Right.
In fact, I mean, if you think about it, making it work on an iPhone with native views is actually pretty impressive. Because the whole, have you seen Notion? Like the stuff you can do in Notion, it's a complicated web app, you know.
Sure.
And to bring that onto an iPhone is difficult. However you want to implement it. I mean, to me, your choice of tooling, there's too many factors that go into it for you to have a particularly maybe strong opinion all the time. Like I think long term, it's always preferable if it could be done natively. Mm-hmm. But you have to take into consideration where you are in the cycle of building the app. Like what are your like business goals, and what are your restrictions and constraints there, and you have to take all that context into mind.
I will take one minor exception, and I think this has always been drilled. This is not drilled, but this is always. It's like a weird. I was once told to make we were trying to like prototype actually the difference between like a web view version of a form entry app. I mean, entering a form versus a native version, right? Just a simple format view. And the native version performed really well comparatively to the web version, which was just a very had a very janky experience because it was trying to like figure itself out in like if you tapped into a location like the keyboard and like it wouldn't scroll properly to the right location or it'd be off centered by a little bit. And then I just remember saying like, well, I remember they were still going to pick the web view version, and I was like, okay, but like, what's more valuable to you? There was this whole concept about business value, very nebulous concept of like, what provides the best business value? What that ultimately means is like, in their mind, it's easier to develop a web version of this and update it without Apple approval, which, to be fair, was like every 7 days at the time. Or you can just get this update out immediately and get it to your customers sooner through the web view. I mean, through your update and then thus through the web view. But I just remember saying, well, that's still like comparatively, like the user experience is still not great. I mean, what's more important, user experience or business value? And with a slight pause, it was like business value.
Well, I mean, yeah, I thought business value would include user experience, but it kind of depends. Like, if it's going to be something that changed a lot, if it was a form that changed often, then maybe it leans in favor of being able to change it more easily. No. Versus if it only going to change once in a while, and most of the time it's just going to be used by people a lot, then maybe you'd prioritize the native version.
What was hilarious about that is that, and I had long moved on at that point, but when the iPad and the iPad and iPhone app came out with their web views, they one-starred that app to death. They one-starred it to death to the point where they actually had to rush, and all the fancy unit tests and UI tests that we'd done, all the sort of setup and all the sort of pomp and circumstances of like agile building being like strict TDD and all the sort of like, I mean, it was a fun experience. Don't get me wrong. I had a great time, but like got rewritten from scratch
as native.
As native.
Yeah, that's something to keep in mind. I mean, you could have a perfectly valid business reason to say, I'm going to do this stuff with the web technologies, and I know it's going to be slower. Mm-hmm. But you got to understand that if it's too, I said, incongruent or too much of a performance problem, you might get a lot of bad reviews. Is that going to be a problem for your brand or for your app's uptake? It might be, it might not be. It kind of depends what it is. Like if it's a enterprise app that only people in your enterprise are using, or like only people tangentially related to your enterprise because you're putting in the app store in this case, like it may not matter. It may not matter then if it gets a bunch of 1 stars because it has no effect on whether anyone is going to have to use it or not. But if your whole brand is around the app and you really want that to be a highly rated app and then promoted, and
I mean, it's like any successful restaurant or smart, good, consistently good restaurant. I mean, they have solid foundations. They have great food. They keep the place clean, and it's like but it becomes the little details, right?
Yeah, but there's also plenty of really crappy restaurants that still stay in business, and
Sure.
because their clientele is different from maybe the clientele for the businesses, for the restaurants that are higher rated, but they still find their customers. So you have to understand what it is, like who your customers are, and what the business value is on the software, and what are your important priorities. I totally can see why you would use web technologies sometimes, but I always lean towards native in general, because I think long term, I've just seen so many examples of apps that are like this over the years, where they start out web technologies and they have to switch for performance reasons, or they get killed in App Store ratings or something like that. Sure. And I think if you're going to go through all the effort of making an app for a platform, you should respect the platform as best you can, and try to make it as fast as you can. And
I mean, again, you're still going to make, regardless of what platform you choose, understand, like, when you go cross-platform, even when we're just doing it for like an Apple technology, you have to make conditionals for each platform anyway. Like in the case of like us, maybe we might actually decide maybe the tap bar is a better interface, so we might create that conditional for just iPhone, versus like if we were to do it but iPad and the Mac makes sense. It's a sidebar nav, right? Because that's what's best for the user. And you should probably be like Tron and fight for the user.
With Notion, this whole controversy comes up all the time with like native versus web stuff. I mean, I think the way I come down is it depends on the context, your situation, and it's perfectly reasonable to do web stuff at one point in your development cycle and not later on, or vice versa. And in this case, I don't know if I don't think I would say Notion made any kind of mistake in their thinking of originally doing it with web stuff, because they're a startup, weren't they? So, or maybe still are. They need to get something out quickly and cross-platform.
I mean, it's the same with Slack. It was the same with
and Slack's gotten faster.
What other Electron app is out there? Is
that what it is, Electron?
It was, but I think they switched to native. But I think there's still elements of like a web interface somewhere in that UI. But the iPhone app is native.
They wouldn't have been able to make the investments to make the native version or the native components that made it faster if they were out of business. And they might have been out of business if they had to wait to build a native version of this thing. Also, they were iterating maybe quickly on the initial, the initial idea of the app, the initial kinds of features and stuff, and getting feedback from customers and changing things. Like in the early days, if your business is around like a piece of software, the early days can be a lot of churn, right?
Yeah.
So in web technologies, frankly, are or at least up until maybe recently. Maybe SwiftUI changed that. It hasn't been around long enough to know. But like, it's just a lot easier to make changes.
Sure.
I mean, you don't have to go through app review, and there's a lot of people who know how to do things in web technologies. It is honestly, it's potentially faster to develop for if you have experienced people and infrastructure and stuff for it. If you're like building a web app to begin with and you're trying to add it, but it's not necessarily faster to execute.
If you were to ask me to build an Android app right now, I said, yeah, I probably can, but it'll take me like twice as long to build because I'm not experienced with it. Like if you're a web developer and you're asked to build a native iOS app, like good grief, I wouldn't even know where to start. RayWinterlick.com. But
like, what speed are you trying to optimize for? Speed of development or speed of the app actually executing on a phone?
Sure. Yeah.
It matters. So I feel like these arguments, people just talk in circles about them. There is no one answer for every particular app.
It always falls, in like a lot of things in life, it always falls with the unsatisfactory answer of it depends.
And with that, I think we'll close this little issue here. I think that's what I agree with you. Unless Aaron has some words of wisdom here for a native versus web tech.
No, not really. I don't have a strong opinion on this stuff, or enough experience to have a strong opinion. So.
Cool. Well, that's all we have for today. You can learn more about Philly Cocoa at phillycocoa.org. There you'll find links to our Slack, meetup schedule, and contact info. If you're feeling generous, please leave a rating and review at the Apple Podcast app, or I don't know, some other place, hopefully. Or share the podcast with all your developer friends. And one more thing. What's the object-oriented way to get wealthy?
I don't know.
Inheritance.
That's
Till
cool.
next time. Good luck on your own developer journey. We will cheer for you always.
Is there like an inheritance tax in object-oriented programming?
Yes. It's called the extra baggage that comes with your inheritance. All the stuff from the superclass on down. So basically all your father's sins.